So I started identifying as an educational revolutionary, and I want to talk about that. The purpose of identifying this way is not for the explicit purpose of advocating for violence or bloodshed or any of that sort of thing. I'm not talking about a bloody revolution or any of that kind of crap. And the reason why I started identifying as an educational revolutionary was to socially distance myself from the sort of reformers who wanted to tinker with the education system and make what, from my perspective, was disappointing, uh, tinkering, small scale, changes to the education system. And I felt that a lot of the waves of reform that had come forward by process of way such as the fact that you know they wanted school choice or whatever that led to institutions like for instance charter schools and everything, and that may seem to be a big step and everything, but to me it's a lot of more of the same. In most directions that you look, you don't really see anybody that's really trying anything that's really radically different. And to me, in the strictest, like most technical sense, if you're going to insist on like very narrow terms that are completely precise, then I guess, I could be considered a reformer, but at the same time, the kinds of reforms that I'm seeking are far more bold, and radical, in that what I want to build is, a school system that doesn't remotely resemble the one that I grew up with in any way, shape, or form, and that modern parents may be a little bit weary of because of the fact that it doesn't resemble, the school system that they were part of in the first place. They might come into it a little bit alarmed because this doesn't look like what we're familiar with, but at the same time, I can promise them the results tend to be better. I think part of the problem with Montessori schools, though, is that unfortunately, anybody can call themselves one. That needs to be cracked down on. We need to do a lot more to make sure that the only actual schools that study the Montessori method can actually be call themselves Montessori schools. There needs to be more stringent regulation on that sort of thing, and not just allowing anybody that wants to call themselves a Montessori school to be called a Montessori school. That is a valid concern, in a big way, that some people have raised in my advocacy, and I don't disagree with them. I think this is terrible. This is not a good this is not good that that can happen, that people are allowed to do that, whatever, because you can get charlatans that are trying to, rift off of Montessori Maria's good name, and they might make her look bad as a result and everything. And when in reality they're not even using her actual pedagogy. I mean, I find that highly concerning. I do. It's not that I don't share your concerns. I just think we can walk and chew bubblegum. At the same time, I'm an advocate for public schools using the Montessori method, and I think we made a grave error in judgment when we hired Horace Mann to build a U.S. education system, and we listened to educational ministers snubbing Maria Montessori, back historically and everything. She should have been the one that really built our public education system. It's clear and it's evident to me that our Prussian school system is sick presently. And who do you call, when a human is sick? We call the doctor. And a lot of what I find really interesting about that metaphor too is that the Montessori method is a pedagogy that's based on human development, right? So you go into your doctor, and they say that these children don't learn things at a specific age. They learn them when they're ready and within an age range, and everything. And this pedagogy is completely based on studies of how people learn things. You know, what gets me about the Montessori method and everything is that Maria Montessori was a doctor, and if I know anything about doctors and having interactions with the medical system and everything, I started to realize that I hadn't thought about it before, but they are scientists. I mean, that's why they're always doing tests. They're always trying to prod and poke you with things and everything, and to try to, take blood samples and everything because they're going to send it into the lab. It's going to do testing on it, and it's going to tell them actual results and everything. It may be painful and unpleasant to deal with, but that's what they do. And everything. And they're scientists. They want to get to the bottom and the root of things and everything. Well, the thing is that Maria brought her scientific thinking to her pedology. Like, I'm aware that we're not going to call it studying, but she observed the child. She her method encourages them to make observations of the child and how the child is responding to the teaching methods. So if something doesn't work, the teacher can come back and shake it up and try something different in order to help the student grasp what it is that is trying to what they're trying to get across. But usually, for the most part, they want to be fairly hands off. You know, and everything, but they are allowed to shake it up to try different approaches to see what works in individualized instruction for their students, so that each and every one of them gets what they need to actually grasp what it is that they're trying to learn and everything. And this pedology is so much better than than regular teaching because of this very fact. It's so superior because our teachers are in a lot of ways in a more traditional school they're almost wed to the one method that they're using. You know what I mean? And it's not even just that it's that they don't even necessarily have the tools that they need to shake things up to try something different if the way that their approach that they're using isn't working. They have very limited leeway, and plus when you have to serve a massive community of parents, they're always pushing to keep teachers on a very short and narrow leash at everything so that they don't have the flexibility and control that they have. So it's very difficult for me to say this is the teacher's fault. I know our school system has them on a very tight leash. But to me, a lot of the people that are coming into the school system trying to reform it, as these people that are advocating reforms, they're what they're doing in trying to save the Prussian system from its failures is basically analogous to rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. To me, the U.S. education system in its present form is broken beyond repair. It is time that we admit it to ourselves and everything. And in admitting it, the next step needs to be, essentially stop trying to save it from its own self destruction. Let it burn until there's nothing left of it but ash. Because as it fails and as it falls apart, we will be more able and receptive and received by the U.S. public to go with the go ahead to go and build something better on top of the ashes. You know, as it stands, the U.S. education system is I kind of feel like that scene from The Matrix where it's like the Matrix is a system. The people inside it are not ready to be unplugged. They're so hopelessly dependent on the system that they will fight to protect it, and that makes them our enemies in this and everything. I don't want the Prussian system saved. I don't believe in what it does. I don't share a faith in its common mission statement. I don't have any faith in it anymore. And I consider most of these reformers to be people that are merely rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. The system is sinking. The roof is on fire. Let the motherfucker burn. Burn, motherfucker, burn. I'm serious about all of this. And so, my genuine stance on all this is that we need basically to change the American education system. We need to make a massive shift. The revolution that I'm advocating is one in which we rebuild a new education system on top of the old one, and that would be a Montessori system. Although, in fairness and in synergy with a lot of the arguments that I've gotten in counter and rebuttal to this, we also need to make sure that the new Board of Education is much more stringent about who gets to call themselves a Montessori school. We need to be cracking down and policing on that so only ones that actually use her pedology are able to call themselves that legally.